Get this garbage out of my sight, you worthless old man!
Chad Whitlock didn't just yell. He marched straight up to Solomon Reeves, snatched the heavy mop out of his hands, and threw it violently across the polished floor. Before Saul could even move, Chad grabbed the half-full protein shaker off the counter, unscrewed the lid, and aggressively dumped the sticky pink liquid right onto Saul's clean uniform and leather boots.
Look at me when I'm talking to you! You think you belong here? You're nothing! Get out of my sight!
Chad barked, shoving Saul hard against the shoulder. Solomon staggered back, but kept his hands flat at his sides, his chest heaving under his stained shirt. He looked at the younger man with a dangerous, icy stillness. Chad leaned in so close, his spit hit Saul's face, his voice dripping with pure racial hatred.
People like you keep forgetting your damn place in this school. You black, useless trash. You're nothing but a dirty animal here to clean up after your betters. Scrub it up! On your knees, boy!
A few athletes laughed nervously, but the room went completely cold. Chad walked away laughing, thinking he had just broken a helpless janitor. He had no idea. He had just assaulted a two-time Olympic gold medal boxing legend and retired military master instructor. Chad Whitlock had just signed his own career's death warrant, and in 6 weeks, the whole town would watch him pay. How does a privileged white bully destroy his entire family's multi-million-dollar legacy over a single night of racial violence? Welcome to the silent verdict, where the invisible people they abuse turn out to be the ones holding the executioner's axe. This is the devastating story of Solomon Reeves. And the day the quiet man finally brought the hammer down, turn the volume up. Subscribe now, and watch a predator become the prey. To understand how a strength coach set fire to 150 years of his family's name in 6 short weeks, you have to understand 3 things. You have to understand the school. You have to understand the family that owned it in everything but title. And most of all, you have to understand the man they had all mistaken for furniture. Because Solomon Reeves was not what they thought he was. He was so much more, and so much more dangerous, than anyone at Kingsley Preparatory Academy could have imagined. Kingsley Preparatory Academy sat on 40 acres of live oak and Spanish moss just outside Charleston, South Carolina. It was founded in 1871. Ivy on the brick. A chapel with a bell that had been rung by the same rope for a century and a half. It was the kind of school where the annual tuition cost more than a starter home. And the waiting list ran back 3 generations. Kingsley had a glossy brochure full of words like legacy, and excellence, and character. It had a rowing team, a fencing club, and a debate program that fed the Ivy League like it was a morning commute. It had a brand new athletic center that had cost $11 million, with the Whitlock family name on a shining brass plaque near the front doors. What Kingsley did not have, if you looked past the brochure, was very many black faces. Not in the classrooms, not on the board of trustees, and the ones who were there, staff and students alike, tended not to last very long. The man who made sure of that, quietly, for 19 years, was Preston Whitlock, old Charleston money, the kind that never announced itself, because it never had to. The Whitlock family owned shipping contracts along the coast, half the commercial real estate downtown, and a name that opened every door in the city. Preston sat as vice chair of the Kingsley board. He controlled the athletics endowment. He chaired the finance and facilities committee, and he had a simple, unspoken understanding with every headmaster who ever walked through those oak doors. Preston kept the money flowing. And in return, Preston's world stayed exactly the way Preston liked it. His son Chad had been handed the title of assistant athletic director at 29 years old. On paper, he ran strength and conditioning. In reality, he ran a small and vicious kingdom inside the athletic wing. Chad had never worked a single job he wasn't given. He had never been told no by anyone who mattered. And somewhere in the long, soft process of being raised to believe he was owed the entire room, Chad had grown a specific and ugly cruelty toward the people who cleaned up after him. It made him feel large. It reminded the world of the arrangement. He had help. Trent Vandergriff, the head football coach, was Chad's best friend, and his muscle, a 240-pound wall of a man who thought Chad's cruelty was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Blake Ashby, the dean of students, made discipline problems disappear for the right kids and appear for the wrong ones. Cole Merrick was the facilities manager, which technically made him Soul's supervisor. And Cole had figured out early that the fastest way to stay in Chad's good graces was to make Solomon Reeves's life a daily misery. And Grant Devereaux, the athletic director, was the man who signed off on every bit of it, and then went home each night and told his wife what a terrible shame it all was. 5 men. They ran the athletic wing, the equipment budgets, the lucrative summer camps, the whole revenue machine, and they all knew the same lesson every generation at Kingsley learned in its bones. You do not cross a Whitlock. Above them all sat Headmaster Douglas Fenwick, who ran the school, the way a man walks past a burning house pretending he can't smell the smoke. Eyes forward, hands in his pockets. He knew what happened in the athletic wing. He knew about the staff who had quietly quit. He knew about the complaints that got filed and then simply vanished from the record. And he chose comfort over conscience every single time. And told himself, every single time, that he was just keeping the peace. That was Kingsley Preparatory Academy. That was the machine. And into that machine, 11 years before Chad Whitlock poured a protein shake onto his boots, a quiet man had walked in carrying a mop. Solomon Reeves was born in a shotgun house on the wrong side of the tracks in a Mississippi Delta town so small it never made the state maps. His mother died when he was 4 years old. His father was a name on a birth certificate and nothing more. He was raised by his grandmother, Odessa Reeves, who took in other people's laundry 6 days a week and preached the seventh, and who gave Soul the one sentence he would carry for the rest of his life. The Lord gave you those hands to lift people up. Baby. She used to tell him not to knock them down. There was a boxing gym 2 blocks from Odessa's house. A crumbling cinder block building with a leaking roof and a heavy bag patched together with duct tape, run by an old fighter named Pop Jefferson, who charged the neighborhood kids nothing. Because they had nothing. Saul wandered in one summer afternoon at 9 years old just to escape the heat. And he never really left. He had fast hands and even faster feet. But what Pop noticed first was the boy's temper, or rather, his complete lack of one. You could catch Saul clean, split his lip, rattle him, and he would only nod, reset his guard, and quietly work out exactly how you had done it. That right there is the whole game. So, Pop told him once, any fool alive can throw a punch. A champion is the man still standing when the other man has got nothing left to give. You don't beat him. You outlast him. Saul had it. By 17, he was a national Golden Gloves champion. By 19, he was training for the Olympic trials, and everyone who watched him work said he was going to bring home gold. And then, 3 weeks before the trials, Odessa had a stroke, and Saul looked at the 2 lives laid out in front of him. The one where he chased a medal, and the one where he took care of the woman who had raised him out of nothing. And he chose her without a single second of hesitation. He walked away from the trials and never boxed competitively again. He joined the army instead. Steady pay, discipline, a way to send money home every month. 8 years in, they made him an instructor, then a master instructor. By the end of his career, Sergeant First Class Solomon Reeves was the man they flew across the world to teach hand-to-hand combatives to Rangers and Special Forces. His name was printed in the field manuals soldiers still trained from. He could take a weapon away from 3 attackers with his eyes closed, and then explain to a 4-star general, in a voice as calm and level as still water, exactly why the general's tactical doctrine was going to get young men killed. He had commendations in a box he never opened. He had a reputation on 4 continents. And he had one rule that quietly drove some of the harder officers out of their minds. He taught his soldiers that the highest form of skill a fighter could ever reach was to end a fight without throwing a single punch. When he finally left the service, he went home, and he found the thing that mattered more than any medal or any manual. He found Ruth. Ruth Delacroix was a Charleston schoolteacher with a laugh you could hear clear across a church and a stubbornness that could move buildings off their foundations. She taught 4th grade. She spent her free evenings volunteering at a boxing gym for kids in the projects because she believed, the same way Odessa had believed, that you could save a child by giving that child somewhere to put all their anger. Saul walked into that gym one night to volunteer too. He was married to Ruth within the year. He coached after that. That was his life. He did it quietly, at gyms nobody had ever heard of, and he was extraordinary at it. He took a skinny, furious, fatherless boy named Marcus Ellison off a Charleston street corner when Marcus was 12 years old, and he coached him for 8 years. And Marcus Ellison walked into 2 straight Olympic Games and walked out with 2 gold medals around his neck. And when Marcus stood on that podium the first time, with the whole watching world holding its breath, he wept into the camera and said the very first name out of his mouth was Coach Reeves. The man who taught me that my fists were the least important thing about me. The money came calling after that. Endorsements, professional training contracts, a syndicate that wanted to put Soul's face on a wall of legends and pay him more than he'd ever seen. Soul turned all of it down. He didn't want it. He had Ruth. And he had his kids at the community gym. And that, to him, was a whole and complete life. And then Ruth got sick. It was fast. And it was cruel. The way it always is. 18 months after the diagnosis, Solomon Reeves buried the only woman he had ever loved on a gray November morning, and stood at her grave in the cold, and realized he had absolutely no idea what to do with the rest of his days. Ruth had left him one instruction. Near the very end, when the medicine made her drift in and out, "Don't you dare sit in that house and disappear on me." "Solomon," she whispered, "stay near the children. Keep your hands busy. Keep lifting." So he took a job, not a coaching job. He couldn't stand to be in a gym without her in it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He took a job at Kingsley Preparatory Academy as a custodian, because it was 2 miles from the community center where he still volunteered on Saturdays. Because the work was honest and it kept his hands busy. And because at Kingsley, nobody knew who he was. And that was exactly the mercy he was looking for. He kept his Army identification card in the bottom of a drawer under a stack of cleaning invoices. He hung Ruth's old training gloves on a nail inside his supply closet, where he could see them every time he clocked in. And he mopped the floors. And he emptied the bins. And he said good morning to children who mostly never said it back. And he waited for his grief to become something he could carry. 11 years. That is how long Solomon Reeves had been invisible at Kingsley. 11 years of being the help. 11 years of men like Preston Whitlock looking straight through him in a hallway as if he were a coat rack. And in all that time, Not one person at that school had ever bothered to ask the quiet janitor a single real question about who he was, or what he had been, or what those enormous, scared, gentle hands had done in another life. They never asked, and so they never knew. That was their first mistake, and it would turn out to be the most expensive mistake the Whitlock family ever made. It did not begin with the protein shaker on Saul's boots. These things never begin that big. It began small, the way rot always does. Chad had started calling Saul old man about 2 years back. Then it became leaving the weight room deliberately destroyed at the end of the day. Chalk thrown everywhere, equipment scattered across the floor, and standing there smirking while Saul cleaned every inch of it, actually timing him with his phone. Then came the words, "Your kind, your people, it's in you," coded just enough that Fenwick could pretend not to hear them, and plain enough that everyone in the room understood exactly what Chad meant. Trent Vandergriff picked it up like it was a fun new sport. He started bumping Saul in the corridors, shoulder to shoulder, hard enough to knock the older man sideways into the lockers. And never once looking back, Blake Ashby, the dean, wrote Saul up twice for insubordination. Once for using the wrong staff entrance, and once for a trash bin that Cole Merrick had personally overturned an hour before the inspection. Grant Devereaux cut 6 hours a week off Saul's schedule and quietly handed the money to a part-time equipment kid who happened to be Chad's cousin. And Cole Merrick, Saul's own supervisor, ran interference on all of it. Because Cole understood the food chain better than anyone, he made sure Saul got the worst shifts, the double cleanings, the jobs no one else would touch. When the athletic center's grease trap backed up on a Friday night before a home game, Cole didn't call a plumber. He called Saul at 9 o'clock at night and left him alone in the dark to handle it himself. Saul did all of it. He never raised his voice. He never filed a complaint. He believed anyone would honor. But do not mistake his silence for surrender, because Solomon Reeves was neither a passive man nor a foolish one. Sergeant First Class Reeves had spent an entire career learning that you do not win a war by flinching at the first shot fired. You win by watching, by recording, by waiting, with terrible patience, until your enemy has committed himself so completely to a bad position that there is no possible way left for him to retreat. So Saul started watching, and he started writing it all down. He kept a small leather notebook in the inside pocket of his jacket. Dates, times, every word. Verbatim. He wrote down the 6 hours a week they had stolen from his check. He photographed the overturned bins before he cleaned them up. He wrote down every corridor bump, every bogus write-up, every slur that Chad Whitlock thought disappeared harmlessly into the air. He saved every email, every schedule change that only ever seemed to affect him. He was building a case, one clean, dated, patient entry at a time. But that notebook was not the thing that was going to bring the house down. That notebook was only about Saul. And Saul, as it turned out, was the least important part of what he had quietly uncovered in his 11 years of walking those empty halls in the dead of night. Because somewhere in all those years of mopping floors after the school had gone dark and silent, Solomon Reeves had learned something about Kingsley Preparatory Academy that the Board of Trustees had spent 2 full decades making sure no one would ever find out. He had learned what was really happening to the Cornerstone Fund. The Cornerstone Fund was Kingsley's crown jewel, at least on paper. It had been established in 1969, at the tail end of a long and overdue reckoning, and it existed for exactly one purpose: to bring low-income students, most of them black, most of them local children, into a school that had spent its first 100 years working very hard to keep them out. Over the decades, alumni and donors had poured money into that fund. Millions of dollars. The brochure said the Cornerstone Fund had transformed hundreds of young lives. The brochure said Kingsley was deeply committed to access and opportunity and character. The brochure was a lie, and Solomon Reeves was slowly, patiently gathering the proof. It had started 2 years earlier, with something almost too small to notice. Cleaning the administrative wing late one night, Sol had seen that the office of Delphine Carter, the school registrar, was still lit at 11 o'clock. Delphine had worked at Kingsley for 30 years. She was the only black woman in that entire front office, and she had watched the place from the inside longer than any living soul. She was sitting at her desk that night, with a tall stack of old ledgers and a face like an approaching thunderstorm. When Sol knocked softly and asked if she needed anything, she looked up at him, and something passed silently between them. It was the look two people give each other when they have both spent their whole lives being invisible inside the very same building. She told him what she had found. Slowly, over months, in the small hours when no one else was in the building, over cups of weak coffee, in a break room, nobody ever watched. Delphine Carter told Solomon Reeves the truth. The Cornerstone Fund was being drained dry. Preston Whitlock, as chair of the Finance and Facilities Committee, had spent years quietly rewiring the way the entire endowment worked. Money that had been legally designated for scholarships was being reclassified, line by line, as program support and facilities enrichment, and then routed straight into the athletic budget. Chad's budget, Preston's world. New scholarship admissions had quietly fallen from a dozen students a year to 2, then to 1, then, in some years, to none at all, while the fund's own public reports still proudly claimed full disbursement to needy children. That gleaming $11 million athletic center with the Whitlock name on the plaque out front, Delphine had come to believe, had been built in large part with money that was supposed to be sending poor kids to school. And every year, when the annual audit came due, all the ugly numbers got quietly smoothed over by an accounting firm that Preston Whitlock's own brother-in-law happened to own. Delphine had documentation, 30 years of it, ledgers, board minutes, disbursement records, internal memos in Preston's own handwriting. A paper trail that stretched back further than anyone realized, because Delphine Carter had never in her life thrown a single document away. She kept it all in a locked file cabinet at the office and a fireproof box at her home. And she had tried to tell someone. She had tried twice. 3 years earlier, she had gone to Headmaster Fenwick with a careful folder full of concerns. Fenwick had thanked her warmly, told her he would certainly look into it. And then, 6 weeks later, Delphine's position had quietly been reclassified in a way that gutted her retirement benefits. The message could not possibly have been clearer. She was 63 years old. She was afraid. She had a pension she could not afford to lose and a sick husband waiting at home. And she had no reason on earth to believe that one more black person raising her voice at Kingsley Preparatory Academy would end any way except badly for her. But when Sol sat down across from her and quietly told her that he had been documenting things too, that he had a notebook of his own, that he was a patient man and he was not afraid, something inside Delphine Carter began to change. For the first time in 30 long, lonely years, she was not the only one in the building who could see it. "We wait," Sol told her, his voice low and certain. "We keep building. We do not move 1 inch until we simply cannot lose. And we do not stop until it is on the record, out loud, where nobody on God's green earth can ever bury it again." They shook hands on it, and they waited, which brings us back around to that protein shake on Sol's boots, and to the one child in that whole cold building that Solomon Reeves had quietly decided to protect. His name was Isaiah Calloway. He was 16 years old, and he was one of the very last Cornerstone Scholarship students Kingsley had admitted, before Preston Whitlock's quiet theft ran the well dry. Isaiah lived across town with his mother and two little sisters. His mother worked the overnight shift at the medical center. Isaiah rode 2 city buses each way, every single day, to attend a school that never once let him forget he was not supposed to be there. The athletes ran him ragged. Trent Vandergrift's football players, the ones Chad trained, the ones Blake Ashby always protected, made Isaiah's life a torment. They stole his backpack and threw it in the campus pond. They tripped him on the marble stairs. They mocked his shoes, his lunch, his mother's job, and one afternoon in the locker hallway, 3 of them backed Isaiah into a corner and made him stand there while they dumped his gym bag out onto the wet floor and told him, in words Sol overheard from just around the corner, exactly what they thought his kind was good for. The teachers looked away, and when Isaiah worked up the courage to report it to the dean, Blake Ashby wrote Isaiah up for being disruptive and let the athletes off with a laugh and a wink. So Isaiah learned to walk close to the walls, to keep his eyes down on the floor, to make himself small enough to vanish. But there was one place in all of Kingsley where Isaiah Calloway was safe, and it was wherever Solomon Reeves happened to be pushing a mop. It started the way these things do, because Sol noticed him. Of course he did. Sol noticed everything. He saw a furious, frightened, fatherless boy trying with everything he had to make himself invisible, and something in Sol's chest that had been quiet and cold since the day he buried. Ruth sat straight up and paid attention, because he had been that boy once, and he had loved a woman whose entire life was saving boys exactly like that one. And Solomon Reeves was not about to walk past. He didn't make a speech. Sol never made speeches. He simply started leaving the storage room unlocked at the end of the day, and Isaiah started coming in, sitting on an overturned bucket, doing his homework in the one corner of that campus where nobody would ever think to look for him. And they talked about nothing, mostly about everything. Eventually, then one afternoon Isaiah came in with a split lip and knuckles scraped raw and bleeding. Sol looked at him for a long, quiet moment and asked what had happened. And Isaiah said he had finally hit one of them back. He had swung on the biggest of the football players out in the parking lot, and it had felt good for exactly 2 seconds, before the kid's 4 friends had put Isaiah down hard on the asphalt. "I'm tired of doing nothing," Isaiah said, and his voice cracked apart on the last word. "I'm so tired of being the one who just takes it." Sol pulled up a second bucket and sat down across from the boy, elbows on his knees. And for a while he said nothing at all. And then he told Isaiah something he had never told a single soul at Kingsley. "Sit down, Sol," he said gently. "Let me tell you something. An old man learned the hard way. I used to fight," Sol said. "A long time ago. I was good at it. Good enough that people were certain it was going to be my whole life. And there was a night, when I was about your age, when 4 boys jumped me outside a gym over nothing at all, over the color of my skin and the street I was born on, and I could have hurt them. Isaiah, even then, I knew exactly how, and I wanted to. Every single part of me wanted to make those boys feel what they were making me feel. And you know what my grandmother said to me when I came home that night wanting blood? She said, 'The Lord gave you those hands to lift people up, not to knock them down.' And I didn't understand it. I thought she was telling me to be weak, to just take it and swallow it. It took me 30 years, a whole career, and burying the best woman who ever walked this earth before I finally understood what that old woman meant. She was not telling me to be weak. She was telling me that the single strongest thing a man can ever do is refuse to become the very thing that's trying to break him. Anybody can hit back. That's easy. That's nothing. That is exactly what they want you to do. Because the instant you swing, you become the problem. You become the disruptive one. You become the one they get to throw out the door. That's the whole trap. You want to beat these people, Saul said, and his voice dropped down low and hard and certain. Then you do not give them the fight they are begging you for. You keep your hands open. You keep your head up high. You do everything right. So right that they cannot lay a finger on you. You document every last thing. You wait. And when the real moment finally comes, you stand up so tall and so clean that the whole entire world sees. All at once. Exactly what they are. And exactly what you are. And there is nothing on earth, that they can do about it. That is not weakness. Isaiah, that is the hardest thing there is. That is discipline. Isaiah stared at him for a long time. He did not fully understand it. Not yet. But he trusted the man completely. And he wiped his eyes with the back of his scraped hand. And he picked up his backpack. And before he left the storage room, he said something that would matter far more than either of them could possibly have known. I've been filming them, he said quietly. On my phone? What they do to me. I don't even know why. I wanted somebody to see it someday. To know it was real. Sol looked at the boy for a long moment. And something moved behind his eyes. Keep filming, he said. Back it up somewhere safe. And Isaiah, do not breathe a word of this to a single living soul. While Solomon Reeves and Delphine Carter and one frightened teenage boy quietly built something in the dark, Chad Whitlock was building something too. He was building himself a stage. And he was too arrogant to even realize it. It was Preston's idea. In the beginning, the Whitlock family name was going up on the athletic center at a grand reopening gala that spring. A huge public event for the school's biggest donors, its wealthiest alumni, and the local press, and Preston wanted a genuine spectacle, something to show off the shining new facility, the culture the family was building, the whole gleaming machine, and Chad, always desperate to perform for his father, seized on an idea that split his face into a grin, a boxing exhibition. Kingsley had just installed a competition-grade ring inside the new center, as part of a partnership with an expensive combat fitness brand that Chad had personally talked the school into sponsoring. Chad fancied himself a real fighter. He trained. He had a private coach. He wore the fancy gloves. He posted the videos. He never shut up about the sweet science. So Chad proposed a headline exhibition for the gala, a series of demonstration bouts, all leading up to the main event, which would be Chad himself, showing the whole town of Charleston what a Whitlock could do. And Chad, because he was exactly who he was, decided that the single funniest part of the entire evening would be to put the old black janitor in the ring first, and beat him bloody in front of everyone. He pitched it to his crew in the coach's lounge, laughing so hard he could barely get the words out. We put a set of headgear on the mop man, he said, throwing a few loose, showy punches at the air. Give the crowd a good laugh before the real fights start. He can barely lift a trash can. Boys, it's gonna be hilarious. Trent thought it was hilarious. Cole thought it was hilarious. Grant Devereaux said maybe that wasn't such a great idea, and then went home and told his wife what a terrible shame it all was. Chad cornered Sol 2 days later, in the middle of the athletic center, in front of a dozen students and a couple of his coaches. He always made absolutely certain he had an audience. Hey, Olmen, Chad called out, loud and bright. Big event coming up. The gala. We're doing a boxing exhibition in the new ring. He grinned wide. And I want you in it. You and me? Couple of rounds. Show all the donors what happens when the help gets ideas above their station. The students laughed. Saul set down his mop, slow and deliberate. You want me to box you? Saul said. Flat. Not a question. I want to give the crowd a real show. Chad said, stepping in closer, dropping his voice down into that soft, poisonneux registre. I want everybody in this town to see the natural order of things laid out plain. He looked Saul up and down, at the gray coming in at his temples, at the custodian's uniform, at the deep, unnerving quiet in the man's eyes, and he mistook every single bit of it for weakness. Unless you're scared, Chad said, smirking. You scared. Utman. And here is the exact thing that Chad Whitlock, in his entire privileged, protected, effortless life, had never once been taught how to see. He looked at Solomon Reeves, and he saw a broken-down old janitor. He did not see the thick scar tissue across the knuckles. He did not see the way the man's weight had already, without a thought, settled perfectly balanced over the balls of his feet. He did not see the stillness, that terrible, passion, bottomless stillness of a man who had personally taught the most dangerous soldiers on the planet how to end a human life, and had then spent the entire rest of his own life quietly choosing not to. Saul looked at Chad for a long 5 seconds, then 10, and Chad, who could not stand silence, who needed the noise and the laughter to feel like a big man, felt something cold and unfamiliar crawl slowly down his spine, something he did not have a name for. And then Saul nodded. Slow and easy. All right, he said quietly. I'll box you. The students whooped and hollered. Chad laughed and clapped Saul hard on the shoulder, already picturing the highlight reel, and walked away feeling 10 feet tall. He had just, with his own mouth, in front of a room full of witnesses, invited a 2-time Olympic gold medal boxing coach and a retired master combatives instructor into a boxing ring. At a public event, in front of the press and the cameras, and asked him to demonstrate the natural order of things. That night, in the quiet of his supply closet, Solomon Reeves took Ruth's old gloves down off the nail for the first time in 11 years. He held them for a long while, turning them over in his enormous hands, remembering. And then he made a phone call to a number he had not dialed in 2 years. A familiar voice answered on the second ring. Coach, the voice said, and it broke a little on the single word. Coach Reeves, is that really you? Hello. Marcus, Saul said. I need to ask you for a favor. Now stop for 1 second. And let me put you right there in it. Right in that man's skin. Picture being Solomon Reeves, 54 years old. You buried the only woman you ever loved. You took the quietest, most invisible job you could find, just to keep yourself breathing. And every single day, some spoiled boy half your age, a boy who was handed every single thing he has, pours a drink onto the floor you just cleaned, calls you a dirty animal, tells you to get down on your knees in front of children, and the whole room watches him do it, and the whole room says absolutely nothing, and you go home to an empty, silent house, and you look at your dead wife's boxing gloves hanging on a nail, and you decide, one more time, that you are not going to give them the fight they are dying for. That is discipline. That is a man who understands something the loud people never learn. That the single loudest thing in this entire world is a hard truth, told at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right crowd. Chad Whitlock thought he was setting a trap for a helpless old man. What he was actually doing was building a courtroom. He was hanging the lights. He was seating the jury. He just had absolutely no idea who the judge was going to be. And he had no idea that this time, For the first time in the entire history of the Whitlock family, the verdict was going to be read out loud. Now, back to it. The gala fell on a warm Saturday evening in late spring, exactly 6 weeks after Chad Whitlock poured a protein shake onto Solomon Reeves's boots and told him to get on his knees. And Kingsley did not do anything halfway. The ancient live oaks were strung with 1,000 tiny lights. A jazz trio played on the stone terrace. 200 guests arrived in cocktail dress. Alumni, major donors, the mayor of Charleston himself, 3 members of the State Board of Education, and, because Preston Whitlock had made a few quiet phone calls, a reporter and a photographer from the city's biggest newspaper, and, most fateful of all, a full local television news crew, there to broadcast the transformation of Kingsley athletics lived to the entire region. Preston Whitlock wanted the whole city to watch his family's name light up in the night. He was about to get his wish, in a way he could never have imagined, in his darkest nightmare. The new athletic center gleamed like a jewel box, and in the very center of the main floor stood the competition ring, its ropes pulled taut, its canvas bright white under the lights, banners hanging from the high rafters. Rows of folding chairs surrounded it on all sides, and near the front doors, that little brass plaque caught the light. The Whitlock Family Center for Athletic Excellence. 3 people had come to that gala, for reasons that had nothing to do with a ribbon cutting. The first was Naomi Brandt, the reporter. Naomi had spent 2 grinding years chasing a story about how private school endowments across the South quietly failed the very students they claimed to serve. And a source she trusted had told her something strange. If she wanted to finally understand the story, the source said, she should come to the Kingsley Gala, and she should watch the custodian. Naomi had no idea what that could possibly mean. She had come anyway, and she was standing at the back of the room with a notebook, watching everything with a hunter's patience. The second was Vivian Marsh. Vivian was the newest member of the Kingsley Board of Trustees, the first black woman ever to hold that seat. Appointed the year before as what Preston Whitlock privately called optics and publicly called progress, Vivian had spent 12 long months on that board with a growing, sickening certainty that something at Kingsley was deeply and fundamentally wrong. The numbers she was shown never quite added up. The questions she asked were always answered with a warm smile and a smooth change of subject. So she had started reading. She had started counting. And 3 weeks before the gala, Delphine Carter had very quietly slid a single sheet of paper across a break room table into Vivian's hand, and had said only 6 words. Ask about Cornerstone. Be at the gala. The third was Marcus Ellison. Though almost no one knew he was coming, the exhibition began after the speeches. Preston Whitlock stood at a podium in his perfect gray suit and spoke about legacy, and excellence, and character, to warm and generous applause. Chad spoke about the bright future of Kingsley athletics, and then the demonstration bouts began. A couple of coaches sparring lightly, an alumnus who had boxed in college, all of it a warm-up. All of it, building toward the moment Chad had been grinning about for 6 full weeks. The moment the cameras were rolling live for, "Ladies and gentlemen," Chad said into the microphone, laughing, bouncing on his toes in the ring in a fresh pair of gloves. "We have got a very special treat for you tonight. Our very own Mr. Reeves has agreed to go a couple of rounds with me. Let's all give the old-timer a big hand." There was laughter. There was scattered, uncertain applause. And then Solomon Reeves stepped out from the corner of the room in a plain gray t-shirt, with Ruth's old gloves laced up over his weathered hands, and he climbed slowly through the ropes into the ring. And the room did not yet understand what it was looking at, but he moved differently. The instant his feet touched that canvas, the people in the front rows saw it first, the way he stepped through the ropes. The way he settled his weight, the way his hands came up, not high and tight and frightened, but low and loose and perfectly, economically placed. It was the guard of a man who had never once in his entire life been afraid of what was standing in front of him. A hush began to spread through the front rows. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The mop man moved like water flowing downhill. The bell rang. Chad came out fast. And loud. Showing off. Snapping a hard jab straight at the old man's head to a cheer from his football players in the second row. And Solomon Reeves simply was not there. He slipped it by 2 inches without moving his feet an inch. Chad threw a hook. Not there. He threw his straight right. His very best punch. The one he posted videos of online. Thrown with every ounce of his strength at the old custodian's chin. And Sol tilted his head half an inch. And the punch sailed harmlessly past his ear. And for the first time in his entire life, Chad Whitlock felt the cold thing on his spine turn to solid ice. Sol did not hit him. That was the thing the room slowly, breathlessly began to understand. In a silence that grew deeper with every passing second, he did not throw one single punch. He simply was never, ever where Chad was punching. Round 1. And Chad Whitlock threw everything he had. Every combination. Every trick his expensive personal coach had ever taught him. At a 54-year-old janitor, and not one of them landed. Not one. And the old man's hands never once closed into a fist that traveled forward. He slipped. He rolled his shoulders. He stepped off at strange angles that sent Chad stumbling past him into empty air. Over and over. He made the strength coach, the Whitlock heir, look like a small child, swinging wildly at a shadow on the wall. And the cameras broadcast every humiliating second of it. Live. To the entire region. By the end of the first round, not one single person in that room was laughing anymore. Chad staggered back to his corner, heaving. Red-faced. Drenched in sweat. Humiliated in front of his father. His town. And a live television audience. His coach whispered something urgent. Chad shook him off violently, and when the bell rang for the second round, something ugly and ancient took over the boy, who had never once in his soft life been told the word no. He didn't box. He rushed. He put his head down and charged Solomon Reeves into the ropes and started swinging like a man possessed. And when that didn't work, when the old man simply covered up and let the wild punches burn themselves out against his forearms and his elbows without landing a single clean shot, Chad Whitlock did the thing that ended everything. He grabbed the front of Sol's t-shirt with his left hand, and he tore off his own glove with his teeth, and he screamed into the old man's face, loud enough for the microphones and the cameras and every living soul in that hall to hear it. Every ugly word of it. Broadcast live across Charleston. Get down. You animal. Chad screamed. Spit flying. Get down on your knees where you belong. Boy, you black piece of trash. I will put you in the ground. And outside the ring, Trent Vandergriff stood up. Get him. Chad. Trent roared. And it was not quiet. Put him down. And then it was not a boxing match anymore. Cole Merrick moved fast to the ring apron. Blake Ashby was on his feet. Chad, in a blind fury, still gripping Sol's shirt with his bare left hand, cocked back his right and threw a punch with every ounce of his hate at a man who was no longer defending an exhibition, but was standing alone in the middle of a mob. And 200 people watched it happen. And Naomi Brandt's photographer's camera fired again and again. And the live news camera zoomed in tight. And Isaiah Calloway, sitting in the third row, exactly where Sol had made sure the boy would have a seat, raised his phone and pressed record. and 150 years of a certain kind of order at Kingsley Preparatory Academy leaned all the way out over the edge of a very tall cliff, and Solomon Reeves finally, for the first time in 11 long years, moved like the man he actually was. He did not throw a punch. You have to understand that, in the entire thing that followed, in front of the whole watching world, Sergeant First Class Solomon Reeves, Master Combatives Instructor, never once struck a single human being. When Chad's bare right hand came, Sol's left forearm redirected the wrist a few inches off its line. His right hand cupped the back of Chad's cocked elbow, and with a single small rotation of his hips, the exact same movement he had taught to 1,000 young soldiers, Chad Whitlock's own furious momentum carried him up, and over, and down onto the canvas flat on his back, hard enough to punch every bit of air out of his lungs, gentle enough to break nothing at all. The sound of it, a single heavy, flat, echoing thud, rang off the high rafters into total, absolute silence. Trent Vandergriff came over the ropes, 240 pounds of enraged football coach, and Sol pivoted, caught the big man's lead arm, stepped smoothly across his path, and let Trent's own charging weight sweep his legs right out from under him. Trent went face first into the canvas beside Chad. Cole Merrick froze on the ring apron. And that half-second of hesitation was all that Solomon Reeves needed. He simply reached out, took the man's wrist in a joint lock that folded him gently to his knees on the apron, held it for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough for Cole to understand, completely and forever, precisely what could have happened to him. And then he let go. Blake Ashby stopped dead where he stood, both hands flying up, and backed rapidly away. And then Solomon Reeves stood alone in the center of that ring, in his dead wife's gloves, breathing slow and even, without a single mark on him. 3 grown men were on the ground around him, and a 4th was backing away with his hands up, and he had not thrown a single punch. He looked out at 200 silent, staring, horrified faces, and at the little red light of the live television camera, and he did the one thing that not one single person in that room, or watching at home, ever forgot for the rest of their lives. He reached down, and he offered Chad Whitlock his open hand. Chad slapped it away and spat at him from the floor, and into that ringing, absolute, breathless silence. A voice came from the very back of the room, a voice that half the country would have recognized instantly, because it belonged to one of the most famous athletes in all of America, Coach. 200 heads turned as one. Standing just inside the doors, in a suit that cost more than most cars, having driven himself there alone, was Marcus Ellison, 2-time Olympic gold medalist, a face-off cereal boxes and magazine covers and billboards, the most decorated amateur boxer his entire generation had ever produced. And he was staring at the old custodian in the ring with tears standing bright in his eyes. "Coach Reeves," Marcus said again, and his voice cracked wide open, and he started walking toward the ring through a crowd that parted before him in stunned, dead silence. "That's my coach." He climbed up onto the apron, and Solomon Reeves turned toward him, and the young champion wrapped the old custodian up in a fierce embrace, in the middle of that ring, in front of 200 people and a live camera, and he held on tight. Then Marcus Ellison turned around, one arm still around Sol's broad shoulders, and he looked out at the crowd, at Preston Whitlock, frozen and gray-faced at the head table, at Chad, still down on the canvas, at the reporter with her mouth open and her pen flying, at the little red light of the live broadcast camera, sending every word straight into 100,000 living rooms across Charleston. And Marcus Ellison told them exactly who they had spent the evening laughing at. "This man," Marcus said, and his voice rang out clear and hard into every corner of that silent hall. This man coached me for 8 years. This man took me off a street corner when I was 12 years old, when my father was gone and I had nothing in this world but anger, and he gave me a life. His name is Sergeant First Class Solomon Reeves, United States Army. Retired. Master Combatives Instructor. He trained Army Rangers. He trained Special Forces. His name is printed in the field manuals. They still teach soldiers from today. And when I won my first gold medal, and the entire world was watching me, the very first thing I said, the very first word out of my mouth, was his name. Because this man is the one who taught me that my fists were the least important thing about me. Marcus looked down slowly at Chad Whitlock, still sprawled on the canvas, and you put headgear on him for a laugh. Marcus said, very quietly, and the words landed in that room like stones, dropped into a still pond. You called that man an animal. On live television. In front of your whole town. Nah. 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 Let me make absolutely sure you caught all of that. A man spends 11 years mopping their floors. He never raises his voice one time. He takes the shoves, and the slurs, and the stolen hours. All of it. Quiet as a stone. And when the little tyrant finally drags him into a ring to break him in front of the whole town, on live television, he does not throw one single punch. Not one. He just refuses to fall. He refuses to become the thing they are. And then he reaches down, bleeding, pride and all, and offers his own tormentor a hand up off the floor. And in that exact moment, the truth walks in the front door, wearing 2 Olympic gold medals, and calls him coach. In front of 200 people who spent an entire decade looking straight through him like he was a piece of furniture. If your chest is not tight right now, go and check your pulse. But here's the part I truly need you to understand. Because this is the part that separates a real story from a bedtime fairy tale. Winning that room was not the end of it. Not even close. Men like Preston Whitlock do not lose a room and simply drive home and accept it. When you humiliate that kind of power on live television, that power does not apologize. That power retaliates with everything it has, and within 72 hours, the entire Whitlock machine was going to try to bury Solomon Reeves so deep in the ground that he would never see daylight again. They just had no idea that the quiet man had already buried something of his own. Years ago, and it was about to come clawing its way up out of the earth. And when it did, it was going to take the whole Whitlock empire down into the hole with it. Now, back to it. Because the gala had been broadcast live, there was no cover-up possible for the assault itself. It was already everywhere before the valet line had even cleared. Isaiah's uncut footage. 11 full minutes of it. From Chad's opening words to Marcus Ellison's embrace. Hit the internet before midnight. Naomi Brandt's photos ran on the newspaper's website by 1 a.m. The live news clip was replaying on a loop by dawn, and then the story left Charleston entirely and went nationwide. The custodian they laughed at was an Olympic legend. It crossed state lines by sunrise. Marcus Ellison reposted the video himself with just 4 words. That's my coach. Watch. 3 million views in 72 hours. Then 10 million. Then 30. The clip of a 54-year-old man in his dead wife's gloves, refusing to throw a single punch while a mob came at him, and then offering his tormentor a hand up off the floor. Ran on morning shows all across the country. Veterans posted about him. Champions posted about him. A retired general's soul had once served underwent on national television and said, "That man forgot more about honor than most people ever learn." Solomon Reeves did not watch any of it. He went home. He hung Ruth's gloves back on their nail. He sat down at his kitchen table. And he wrote in his notebook, one single line, the same way he ended every hard day of his life. Told the truth today. The rest is up to them. But while Sol slept the sleep of a man with a clear conscience, Preston Whitlock was wide awake. And Preston Whitlock was in a cold, quiet fury. And Preston Whitlock had spent 19 years learning exactly how to make an inconvenient human being disappear. By Monday morning, there were 2 police cruisers sitting in the Kingsley parking lot. An officer met Sol at the staff entrance with a folded document. Chad Whitlock, it turned out, had gone to a private emergency room late Saturday night, complaining of a shoulder injury and a concussion, and had filed a formal assault complaint. So had Trent Vandergriff. So had Cole Merrick. 3 perfectly coordinated statements, filed through the same expensive family lawyer, telling the very same story. An unstable, violent custodian had viciously attacked 3 unsuspecting men during a friendly athletic demonstration, without any provocation whatsoever. And Kingsley Preparatory Academy, on the personal recommendation of Headmaster Douglas Fenwick and the executive committee of the board, was suspending Solomon Reeves without pay, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Sol read the document, standing in the doorway, while a few early arriving students watched in silence. One of them, a freshman he had never once spoken to, stepped forward and said, quietly, "We all saw the video. Mr. Reeves, the whole world saw it." Sol nodded at the boy. He told him to get to class, and he drove home with the suspension notice sitting on his passenger seat. And he did not cry, and he did not panic, because Sergeant First Class Solomon Reeves had been badly outnumbered before, on the far side of the world, and he knew the very first rule of being outnumbered by heart: you do not react. You assess, and then you strike where the enemy is weakest. All at once, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Ellison, who said, "You tell me what you need, Coach, and it is yours. All of it. My lawyers, my money, every last thing I have." And the second phone call was to a woman named Della Okafor. Della Okafor was a civil rights attorney out of Atlanta, one of the very best in the entire South. She was a woman who had spent an entire career dragging exactly this kind of quiet, genteel, institutional rot out into exactly the kind of harsh daylight it could not survive. She had once been a poor scholarship kid herself, at a school not so very different from Kingsley, and she took cases like this one the way other people took breath. She had seen the video, of course, like everyone else in America. When Sol called, she was already halfway to being interested, and when he told her the rest, when he sat at his kitchen table and quietly told her the truth about the Cornerstone Fund, Della Okafor went very, very still. And then she said the words that changed absolutely everything. "They think you are a custodian who got into a fight," she said slowly. "They have no earthly idea that you have been quietly building a fraud case against them for 2 years. Mr. Reeves, they did not just pick a fight with the wrong man. They picked a fight with the one single person inside that entire building who knows exactly where every last body is buried. Do not release one word of it yet." She told him, "Let them commit. Let them build their lie as tall and as public as they possibly can. The taller they build it, Mr. Reeves, the harder it falls. And the more of them it crushes on the way down." Solomon Reeves smiled. "For the first time in 3 days, I have been telling a young man that exact same thing for months now," he said. "They moved to bury him. It is what that kind of power always does." By Tuesday, Preston Whitlock had gotten his version of the story to a friendly local blog and a sympathetic regional station, a disturbing incident at a beloved local academy, A troubled, dangerous employee. 3 respected, injured staff members bravely seeking justice. They ran Chad's photo, smiling in a coaching polo with his arms around student athletes. They ran Saul's staff identification photo, unsmiling under bad fluorescent light. The exact kind of picture that makes any human being on earth look like a criminal. They made no mention of the shaker, no mention of 11 years of slurs, and, most brazenly of all, no mention whatsoever of the plain fact that Soul had never thrown a single punch, a fact that was, at that very moment, being watched on live video by 30 million people. The blog simply pretended the video did not exist and hoped their readers would too. Della told Soul to stay completely off the internet. Anything you post becomes evidence. She said, "Go dark and stay dark." Soul went dark. He ran his 5 miles every morning at dawn, the way he had for 30 years. And he came home. And he and Delphine Carter and Della Okafor sat at his kitchen table night after night. And they built the thing they were going to drop on Kingsley Preparatory Academy like a bomb from a great height. And it turned out that Soul and Delphine had not been the only ones quietly building, because the very day after the video went nationwide, Vivian Marsh, the newest trustee, the optics appointment, the decoration, walked into the Kingsley finance office and formally, in writing, as was her absolute and undeniable right as a member of the board, requested a full and complete accounting of the Cornerstone Fund going back 20 years. Every disbursement, every reclassification, every single dollar. Preston Whitlock tried to slow walk it, the way he had slow walked everything for 19 years. But Vivian Marsh had a law degree and no fear left in her body. And she was completely finished being decoration. When the finance office stalled, she went straight to the full board and read the school's own bylaws out loud. The exact section that granted any trustee the absolute right to inspect any financial record. And she requested it again. On the record, in a room full of witnesses, with the video of the custodian playing in the back of every single mind in that room, and Naomi Brandt, the reporter who had come to that gala on a strange 80, cryptic tip and left with the story of her entire career, was making phone calls of her own. She tracked down the 3 staff members who had quietly left Kingsley over the past decade after clashing with Chad's crew. She tracked down 2 families of former scholarship students who had been quietly pushed out the door. And she tracked down the name of the accounting firm that audited the Cornerstone Fund. And she tracked down the name of the man who owned it. And she discovered that his sister was married to Preston Whitlock. And Naomi Brandt began to write the story that would win her every award journalism has. And Delphine Carter, 63 years old, afraid for 30 long years, drove home one evening after work. And she came back to Soul's kitchen with the fireproof box. She set it down on the table, and she opened it. And inside were 3 full decades of receipts, ledgers, board minutes, internal memos in Preston Whitlock's own unmistakable handwriting, reclassifying scholarship money for poor black children as facilities support for a building with his name on it, disbursement records that did not remotely match the fund's glowing public reports, a paper trail so complete and so utterly damning that Della Okafor, a woman who had seen 100 cases just like it, sat back slowly in her chair and let out one long, low breath. "Delphine," she said quietly, "you just handed me the entire thing. Every last piece of it. I have been holding it for 30 years. Delphine said, and her voice shook. I was so afraid that nobody would ever be brave enough to come and stand next to me. Solomon Reeves reached across the table and put his enormous, gentle hand over her small, trembling one. "You are not standing alone anymore," he said. "You never have to stand alone again." They organized every last piece of it. Chronological, cross-referenced, clean enough for any courtroom in the country and any state board in the land. Saul's leather notebook and his photographs, documenting 2 solid years of racial harassment. Every entry dated. Every entry corroborated. Isaiah's live video from the gala, and the emergency room timeline that proved Chad had filed his injury claim a full 90 minutes after the event. A delay that Della's medical expert would have a great deal to say about. Delphine's 30 years of financial records. Vivian Marsh's formal, obstructed board requests. Naomi Brandt's list of pushed-out staff and students. The name of the audit firm. The marriage certificate that tied it all together in a bow. They were not defending a custodian who got into a fight anymore. They were about to prosecute the Whitlock family in front of the entire state of South Carolina. Della filed a counter-complaint on Solomon Reeves's behalf. Racial harassment, unlawful retaliation, wrongful suspension, and attached to it, a formal, thundering demand for a full state and federal investigation into the misappropriation of the Cornerstone Fund. Along with subpoenas for 20 years of Kingsley's complete financial records. That demand landed on Headmaster Douglas Fenwick's desk on a Thursday morning. He read it twice, and then he closed his office door. And he did not come out for 2 full hours. Because Douglas Fenwick had just realized, all at once, that he had spent his entire cowardly career keeping the peace on top of a landmine. And someone had finally, deliberately, stepped on it. The board scheduled a special open session for the following Thursday. Both sides would present their evidence. The entire community was invited to attend. The State Board of Education, having received Della's formal complaint, sent 2 official observers, and the Charleston newspaper, holding Naomi Brandt's finished, explosive story, agreed to run it on the front page on the very morning of the hearing. Preston Whitlock spent that week doing the only thing he had ever known how to do. He made his calls. He had been on that board for 19 years. He had shaken every hand in that room at church on Sunday mornings. He reminded each and every trustee, casually, carefully, of exactly how much the Whitlock name and the Whitlock money had done for Kingsley over the generations, and of exactly how deeply unwise it would be to take the word of a disgruntled employee over 3 respected staff members and a founding family of Charleston. But Preston Whitlock was making the very same fatal mistake his son had made 6 weeks earlier. He thought this was still about a fight. He thought that if he could just control the room, he could control the outcome, the way he always had, and for 19 years, controlling the room had been more than enough. He had absolutely no idea that Solomon Reeves had spent 30 years learning a truth Preston Whitlock had never once had to face, that the man who truly controls the room is never the loudest man in it. The man who controls the room is the quiet one, sitting perfectly still in the back, holding the single truth that, once it is finally spoken out loud, can never, ever be unheard. Thursday, 9 o'clock in the morning. The Kingsley Preparatory Academy Assembly Hall. Every seat was taken. Alumni, parents, students who had cut class and dared anyone alive to stop them, the mayor, the 2 state observers, 3 television news crews, and, standing 3 deep along the back wall, people who had driven in from 3 counties away because they had watched the video, and now they needed, with everything in them, to see how this story ended. That morning's newspaper sat open in 100 laps. Naomi Brandt's front-page investigation printed above the fold. Kingsley's broken promise. How a scholarship fund for the poor was used to build a palace for the privileged. You could feel the entire room reading it at once. A low electric hum of dawning fury. The board sat behind a long table on the stage. 7 trustees. Harriet Langford. The chair. In the center, Preston Whitlock at the far end. Gray suit. Silver watch. His expensive lawyer at his shoulder. Vivian Marsh. 2 seats down from the chair, with a thick folder squared in front of her and a spine made of pure steel. Chad Whitlock sat in the front row beside his father's lawyer, a sleek and costly man named Grissom, flanked by Trent, and Cole, and Blake, and Grant, all of them in freshly pressed collared shirts, all of them carefully coached to look like the victims. Chad had his arm in a sling that Della Okafor's medical expert would, in about an hour, describe under oath as medically unnecessary theater. And on the other side of the aisle sat Solomon Reeves, in a plain dark suit he had last worn to a wedding a lifetime ago, with Della Okafor beside him, Delphine Carter directly behind him, Isaiah Calloway 2 rows back next to his mother, who had taken the entire morning off from her sleep after a night shift to be there. And at the very back of the hall, where he had slipped in quietly and drawn every eye in the room that found him, stood Marcus Ellison. Saul sat completely still. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was calm as still water. He looked exactly the way he always looked. Harriet Langford opened the session. She looked slightly ill. "This is a special open meeting of the board regarding the events of the recent gala and related matters," she said. "We will hear from both parties. We will begin with the complainants." Grissom, Chad's lawyer, stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the podium like a man who had never once lost anything in his life. On the evening of the gala, he began smoothly. "My clients, 3 dedicated members of the Kingsley staff, were violently and without any provocation whatsoever assaulted by Mr. Haff at a Solomon Reeves during a friendly athletic demonstration. Mr. Whitlock suffered a shoulder injury and a concussion. Mr. Vandergriff sustained injuries. Mr. Merrick was assaulted. These men are the true victims here. Mr. Reeves is a physically dangerous individual with specialized military combat training who has absolutely no business inside a school full of children. And we are seeking his permanent termination and his full criminal prosecution." He spoke for 20 minutes, and he was good at it. He talked about safety. He talked about the children. He talked about the frightening spectacle of a trained killer brutalizing 3 unsuspecting men. He never once, in 20 full minutes, mentioned the 30 million people who had already watched Solomon Reeves not throw a single punch. When he finally sat down, there was scattered, uncomfortable applause from Preston's side of the aisle, and dead silence from everywhere else. And then Della Okafor stood up. She did not go to the podium. She walked, slow and deliberate, to the very front edge of the stage. And she looked at the 7 members of the board. And then she turned and looked out at the entire packed room. And she let the silence stretch out long and heavy before she said a single word. "My client," she said at last, "did not throw one single punch. 30 million people around the world have now watched him not throw a single punch." She let that sit in the air. We could spend our whole morning here arguing about a boxing match, but I am not going to insult the intelligence of this room, because this was never, ever about a boxing match. So let us begin with the truth. Roll the first exhibit. And then Della Okafor took Kingsley Preparatory Academy apart. Brick. On the record, in front of the entire watching town, she played Isaiah's video first, all 11 minutes of it, and she made the room watch every single second. She watched the trustees flinch at Chad's opening words. She let the whole room hear, in Chad's own recorded voice, the words "animal," and "boy," and "black piece of trash," and "I will put you in the ground." She showed the exact moment Trent Vandergriff came over the ropes, and the mob began to form. And then she froze the frame on the precise instant that Solomon Reeves reached down and offered Chad Whitlock his open hand. And she left that single image up on the screen for a long, unbearable moment. And the room was so silent, you could hear the fan inside the projector. She called her medical expert, who testified plainly that Chad's emergency room claim had been filed 90 minutes after the incident, that the injuries described were completely inconsistent with the video evidence, and that the sling on Chad's arm was, in her professional medical opinion, pure decoration. She entered Sol's leather notebook and his stack of photographs into the permanent record, 2 solid years of documented, dated, corroborated racial harassment, the stolen hours, the overturned bins, the write-ups for daring to use the wrong door. She called, one after another, the 3 former staff members that Naomi Brandt had found, and each of them described, in a quiet and shaking voice, the exact same pattern of intimidation from Chad Whitlock's crew that had driven them out of their jobs and out of the school. And then Della Okafor said, "And now, let us talk about the Cornerstone Fund." And Preston Whitlock's lawyer shot to his feet like he'd been burned. "Objection," Grissom said sharply. "This hearing concerns the incident at the gala. The scholarship fund is completely and entirely irrelevant to these proceedings. And I must insist that we sit down." "Mr. Grissom," said Vivian Marsh. From the board table, every single head in the hall turned. Vivian Marsh stood up, holding her thick folder, and she was very plainly not asking anyone's permission for anything. "I am a trustee of this school," she said, and her clear voice rang out across the packed hall. "And 3 weeks ago, I filed a formal written request for a full accounting of the Cornerstone Fund, which is my absolute right under the bylaws of this institution, which I am fully prepared to read aloud into this record right now, if any person at this table would like to challenge me on it." She turned her head and looked directly down the table at Preston Whitlock. "That request has been stalled and obstructed and ignored. So I am now going to enter into the public record precisely what I have found entirely on my own, and I would very strongly advise this board to listen to every word of it, because there are 2 representatives of the State Board of Education sitting in the 3rd row of this room, and they drove a very long way to be here this morning." Harriet Langford, the chair, looked at Preston Whitlock. Then she looked at the 2 state observers in the 3rd row. Then she looked, for one long moment, at the 30 million eyes she could feel pressing on that room through the lenses of the news cameras. And she made the only decision left to a coward, at the precise moment that cowardice finally runs completely out of room to hide. "The trustee," she said quietly, "may proceed." And Vivian Marsh proceeded. And then Della Okafor proceeded. And then, when she was finally called to the stand, Delphine Carter proceeded, with 30 full years of receipts stacked in front of her. They laid the entire thing bare on that stage. The reclassifications, the scholarship money for poor children routed straight into the athletic budget, the dozen admissions a year that had quietly dropped to almost none, while the reports claimed full disbursement, the $11 million center built on stolen opportunity, the audit firm, owned by Preston Whitlock's own brother-in-law, and Preston's handwriting, memo after memo after memo. In his own hand, Delphine Carter, 63 years old, afraid for 30 years, held up one single memo in her trembling hand, and she read it aloud into the microphone in a voice that started out shaking and got stronger, and stronger, and stronger with every single word. And when she was finished, she looked up from the paper, and she looked straight down the long table at Preston Whitlock, the man who had gutted her retirement for daring to ask a question 3 years earlier, and she said, in a voice that did not shake at all anymore. I have watched this school steal from children for 30 years, and I was afraid, and I am not afraid anymore. The room did not applaud. The room made a sound like 200 people, letting go of a breath they had been holding for a very long time. Preston Whitlock stood up. His face had gone from red to gray to white. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, and Preston shook it off, and he opened his mouth, and for the first time in 19 years, Preston Whitlock discovered that he had absolutely nothing to say that could possibly survive being spoken out loud in that room. And then Della Okafor delivered the final blow. And she delivered it very, very quietly. I want to be completely clear about what happened here, she said, turning slowly to face the entire room. For 11 years, this institution looked at Solomon Reeves and saw a man to empty their garbage. They saw a uniform. They saw the color of his skin, and they decided that made him nobody at all. And because they were so absolutely certain that he was nobody, they let him walk freely through every room, and every hallway, and every after-hours corner of this building, for 11 years. And it never once occurred to a single one of them that the invisible man was watching them, that he was the most decorated soldier in the entire county, that he had trained Olympic champions, that he had more honor in his one open hand than this entire board has shown in 20 years of smiling for the cameras. They humiliated him because they were certain he could never hurt them. And the entire time, he was the only person in this whole building with the discipline and the patience and the sheer strength of character to hold the truth in his hands until the exact moment it could do the most good for the most people. That, Della said softly, is the one thing about deciding that a man is beneath you. The moment you decide he is beneath you, you stop watching him. And a man you have stopped watching, ladies and gentlemen, sees absolutely everything. She sat down. The hall was silent. And into that silence, at the very back of the room, Marcus Ellison began, slowly, to clap his hands. And then Isaiah Calloway stood up and began to clap. And then his mother stood beside him. And then the students, all of them at once, on their feet. And then the parents, and the teachers, the quiet ones, the ones who had looked the other way for years, the ones who had watched Chad's crew run that building and had said nothing. Absolutely nothing. They all stood now, every one of them, and the sound they made built and built and built until it rolled out the open windows and across the lawn, and rang the old chapel bell that had hung silent on its rope for 150 years. Solomon Reeves did not stand. He sat in his chair, hands folded in his lap, and he looked at Ruth's gloves in his mind, and he let all of that thunder wash over him. And one single tear ran down the face of a man who had refused to let them see him cry for 11 long years. The board did not deliberate for long. They could not. The state was watching. The whole country was watching. The newspaper had already printed it. Harriet Langford came back into the hall after 90 minutes with a single sheet of paper in her hand and a voice that had finally, completely run out of anywhere left to hide. The complaint against Mr. Solomon Reeves, she read, is dismissed in its entirety. Mr. Reeves acted in lawful self-defense against a coordinated physical assault, a fact documented on live video and witnessed by 200 people. His suspension is lifted immediately. He will receive full back pay and a formal written apology from this institution. The room breathed, regarding Mr. Chad Whitlock, Mr. Trent Vandergriff, and Mr. Cole Merrick. She read, and here her voice tightened. The board finds sufficient evidence of sustained racial harassment, the filing of a false police report, and criminal assault. Their employment at Kingsley Preparatory Academy is terminated, effective immediately. and their conduct is being referred, in full, to the office of the district attorney. Chad Whitlock stared at the table in front of him as if it had begun speaking to him in a language he did not know. Regarding Mr. Blake Ashby and Mr. W.W. Grand Devereux, she continued, both are placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation into their roles in the harassment of staff and students, and the suppression of formal complaints. Blake Ashby put his face in his hands. And regarding, Harriet Langford said, and here, at last, her voice broke completely. Regarding the Cornerstone Fund, the board is referring the entire matter of the fund's management over the past 20 years to the State Board of Education and to the appropriate state and federal law enforcement authorities for a full criminal investigation into the misappropriation of charitable and scholarship funds, and Mr. Preston Whitlock is suspended from this board, effective immediately, pending the outcome of that investigation. She set the paper down. She took off her reading glasses, and she looked, for a long moment, at Solomon Reeves. Mr. Reeves, she said, this board failed you. This school failed you. We failed Ms. Carter, who tried to tell us the truth 3 years ago, and we punished her for it instead. We failed the children this fund was created to serve, and we failed them for 20 years while we smiled for the brochure. She swallowed hard. That ends today. I am sorry. I know that it is not nearly enough, but I am sorry. Solomon Reeves stood up slowly. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and he nodded. Ons. That was all. And that was everything. But the silent verdict of Solomon Reeves was not finished. Not by a long way. Because a board hearing can only fire a man. It cannot send him to prison. And the truth that came out on that stage, broadcast live to 30 million people, could not be unheard by the district attorney, or by the state, or by the federal government. Over the months that followed, the whole Whitlock empire came apart at the seams, exactly the way Della Okafor had promised it would. The state opened a formal criminal investigation into the Cornerstone Fund. Within a week, federal investigators, drawn by the scent of charitable fraud and civil rights violations broadcast on national television, opened one of their own. A month after that, and with Delphine Carter's 30 years of receipts, there was nowhere left to hide. Preston Whitlock was indicted. The man whose name opened every door in Charleston was formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. For stealing years of scholarship, money meant for poor children, and using it to build a monument to himself. His expensive lawyers found the charges very intense, very difficult to make disappear, because you cannot bury a paper trail that a registrar has been carefully keeping for 30 years. The shipping contracts dried up as the scandal spread. The commercial tenants downtown quietly did not renew their leases with a convicted family. Within a year, the Whitlock holdings, the multi-million-dollar legacy that Preston had spent his whole life protecting and his whole life poisoning, were being sold off in pieces to pay the lawyers and the settlements. The family mansion went on the market. The Whitlock name, which had opened every door in that city for 150 years, became the one name nobody in Charleston wanted to be associated with. And Chad Whitlock, the boy who was handed everything, who had never once in his life been told no. His false assault case against Solomon Reeves collapsed. The instant the district attorney watched 11 minutes of live video, and then the district attorney charged Chad instead. And when it went to trial, the jury watched that same video. They watched a young man tear off his own glove and scream at an unarmed older man to get on his knees, calling him an animal, on live television, in front of his whole town. And they watched that older man refuse to fall, and refuse to strike back, and reach down to offer his tormentor a hand up off the floor and the jury came back, after less than 3 hours, with a verdict: guilty, on every single count, including the hate crime. They called this channel the silent verdict for a reason, because there were 2 verdicts read that season. There was the loud one, the legal one, the guilty that a jury foreman read aloud in a Charleston courtroom while Chad Whitlock's mother wept in the gallery. But the real verdict, the one that truly brought the Whitlock empire down, was the silent one. It was passed by a quiet man who never raised his voice, and never threw a single punch, and never once asked for a thing for himself. It was a verdict rendered in dated notebook entries, and in 30 years of carefully saved receipts, and in one open hand offered on a canvas floor. The quietest man in the entire building turned out to be holding the executioner's axe the whole time. He just waited, with terrible patience, for them to lay their own necks down on the block. Trent Vandergrift took a plea and left coaching for good. Cole Merrick left the state entirely. Blake Ashby resigned, in disgrace. Grant Devereaux took an early retirement, and, presumably, went home one last time and told his wife what a terrible shame it all was. And Headmaster Douglas Fenwick, the man who had spent his entire cowardly career keeping the peace on top of a landmine, submitted his resignation the following week. And this time, the board accepted an easy decision very easily indeed. The Monday after the board hearing, Solomon Reeves walked back into Kingsley Preparatory Academy through the very same staff entrance where an officer had handed him a suspension notice. He walked past the same brass plaque, which was already scheduled to be taken down. He walked into the same athletic center where a boy half his age had once poured a protein shake onto his boots and told him to get on his knees. But he did not come back to push a mop. The board, in the first genuinely wise thing it had done in a generation, and under an ocean of public pressure, had come to Solomon Reeves with an offer. And Sol, a man who had turned down more money and more glory in his life than any of them could ever imagine, sat down across the table from a chastened board and from Vivian Marsh, who was now the chair, and he made them an offer of his own instead. He did not want a big payout. He did not want revenge. He had already gotten the only justice that mattered to him. He wanted 3 things, and 3 things only. He wanted the Cornerstone Fund fully restored, every stolen dollar traced, and recovered, and returned. And he wanted it placed forever, under independent oversight, with Delphine Carter, with all 30 years of her hard-won knowledge, sitting on the oversight committee, at full pay and full pension, so that no one would ever be able to sneak a single dollar past that woman again. The board agreed. He wanted a real, funded, permanent program at Kingsley, and at any other school that would take it, a program that did 2 things at the very same time. It would teach combat sports and self-defense, and it would teach anti-bullying and dignity, and the hardest discipline of them all, the discipline of refusing to become the thing that is trying to break you. Boxing and character. Exactly the way old Pop Jefferson had taught it in a leaking gym 60 years ago. Exactly the way Ruth had believed in it. Exactly the way it had once saved Marcus Ellison off a street corner. It would be free to every single student who wanted it. And it would go first to the kids that nobody else was watching. Sol would run it himself, alongside Marcus Ellison, who had already said the word yes before Sol even finished the sentence, and 2 other veterans Sol had served with a lifetime ago. The board agreed to that too, and he wanted one last thing, the smallest thing of all, the thing he asked for last, and quietest. He wanted the room in the athletic center, the one with the boxing ring in it, renamed, not for a family that had paid for it with stolen money, but for a 4th-grade school teacher who used to spend her evenings volunteering at a gym for kids who had nothing at all, because she believed, all the way down to her bones, that you could save a child by giving that child somewhere to put all their anger. The Ruth Reeves Center. The board agreed. Of course they did. They called the program Open Hands. Saul named it himself. It came from Odessa, from the one sentence that furious woman had said to a furious boy 60 years ago. The sentence that had taken him an entire lifetime to finally understand. The Lord gave you those hands to lift people up, not to knock them down. A closed fist cannot hold on to anything. Saul told the very first group of kids who lined up in the Ruth Reeves Center on a bright fall morning, it cannot build anything. It cannot help anybody. So we are going to learn how to fight, and then we are going to learn the much harder thing, which is how to be the kind of strong that you never, ever have to use. Within one semester, the program had a waiting list a mile long. Within a year, 4 other schools across South Carolina had adopted it, including 2 public schools in the very neighborhood Isaiah Calloway rode the bus from every morning. Within 2 years, it had reached a dozen schools and become a name that people in that state knew and trusted. And the whole time, right in the very center of all of it, was a big, quiet old man in a gray t-shirt, with his dead wife's boxing gloves hanging on the wall behind him, patiently teaching children the one thing he had spent his entire life learning, that the strongest person in any room is almost never the loudest one, and is almost always the one still standing, hands open. When the noise finally dies down, Isaiah Calloway got his scholarship secured, permanently, out of the newly restored Cornerstone Fund, with the independent oversight of Delphine Carter herself making absolutely certain that no one would ever touch it again. He stopped walking close to the walls. He got faster hands than Saul ever had, and a temper he learned to keep under lock and key. And by his senior year, he was the one quietly leaving the storage room unlocked at the end of the day. For the frightened freshman who needed somewhere safe to disappear to, and Solomon Reeves, the man who had walked into Kingsley 11 years earlier to keep a promise to a dead woman, and to wait for his grief to finally become something he could carry, found that somewhere in the middle of all of it, without ever quite noticing the moment it happened, he had started to truly live again. 1 year later, Solomon Reeves stood in the back of a packed auditorium at the South Carolina Education Awards in Columbia, in the plain dark suit from a wedding a lifetime ago. Hands folded, still as a stone, they were about to give him something. He had not applied for it. Of course, he never did. Marcus Ellison had nominated him, and the state had voted for him unanimously. And Saul had only agreed to come at all because Delphine Carter had looked him in the eye and told him it was not about him. It was about every single child sitting out there in that audience who needed, with everything in them, to see a man like him standing on that stage. The host read the introduction. There was polite applause, and then a different voice came over the speakers and asked if it would be all right to introduce this year's recipient himself. Isaiah Calloway walked out onto that stage. He was 18 years old now. He wore a dark suit that was still just a little too big in the shoulders. He was a senior. He was the very same boy who used to make himself small enough to disappear into a wall. He adjusted the microphone, and he looked out at the crowd, and he began to speak. 2 years ago, Isaiah said, I was invisible. I kept my head down. I figured that if nobody could see me, then nobody could hurt me. And every single day at my school, people who had been handed every single thing they owned spent their time reminding me that I was nothing. He paused, and there was exactly one man in that entire building who actually saw me. He was not a teacher. He was the custodian. He was the man that everybody else looked straight through. The room was completely silent, He told me something one day that I did not understand at all. Isaiah said, I came to him with a busted lip because I had finally hit somebody back, and I was so proud of it. And he sat me down on an overturned bucket in a storage closet. And he said, anybody can hit back. That is exactly what they want. The strongest thing a man can ever do is refuse to become the thing that is trying to break him. He looked toward the side of the stage, toward the big, quiet man standing in the wings. I thought he was telling me to be weak. It took me a very long time to understand that he was telling me to be strong in a way that almost nobody on this earth has the courage to be. His voice grew thick. They put him in a boxing ring to humiliate him, Isaiah said, in front of the whole town, on live television, and 5 of them came at him at once. And do you know what that man did? He did not throw one single punch. Not one. He just refused to fall. And then he reached down, and he offered the man who started it his own open hand. Isaiah looked out at the crowd, and then he found the old man standing in the back, and he stopped fighting the tears rolling down his face. That man saw the truth about a place that had been stealing from kids like me for 20 years. And he held on to that truth, patient as a mountain, until the exact moment it could save the most people. He did not do it for revenge. They took everything he had built, and they suspended him, and they dragged his name through the mud. And when it was all over and he had won, he did not ask for a single dollar for himself. He asked for a scholarship fund to be restored, for kids he would never even meet. He asked for a free program to teach kids like me how to be strong the right way. And he asked for a room to be named after his wife. I am one of those kids. I am going to college in the fall. On the scholarship that he saved, I am not invisible anymore, and I am not walking close to the walls. He stepped back from the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Isaiah Calloway said, my coach, Solomon Reeves. The whole room was on its feet before Saul ever reached the aisle. 2,000 people standing, and Solomon Reeves walked slowly to the front, and he climbed the steps, and he stood behind the podium where a boy he had saved was still wiping his eyes, and he set his 2 enormous, weathered, gentle hands flat on the wood, and he looked out at all of them, and he said 7 words. My grandmother was right about these hands. The applause lasted 4 full minutes. Kingsley Preparatory Academy looks very different now. The Cornerstone Fund admits a full class of scholarship students every single year again, under independent oversight, with Delphine Carter's name on the committee that no one is ever going to sneak anything past. There is an open hands class every afternoon in the Ruth Reeves Center. Vivian Marsh runs the board of trustees, and she runs it with the receipts in a locked drawer and the memory of exactly what silence costs a place. The brass plaque with a certain family's name on it came down a long time ago. Nobody misses it. Solomon Reeves still runs his 5 miles at dawn. He still keeps a notebook, though the entries in it are very different now. And on some mornings, before the kids come in, he stands alone in the Ruth Reeves Center, under the banner, and he looks up at his wife's old boxing gloves, which hang now on the wall where every single child who walks through that door can see them, and he reads the words painted above them, the words that took him a whole lifetime to earn the right to understand. The Lord gave you those hands to lift people up, and then he opens the doors, and he lets them in. So picture it. One last time. Picture being a man that the whole world has quietly agreed is furniture. A man who exists only to clean up after people who were handed everything and who never once had to see him as human. Picture holding a lifetime of skill and strength and hard-won honor in your 2 hands and choosing every single day to refuse to use it to hurt the very people who are hurting you, not because you can't, but because a woman who took in laundry 6 days a week taught you what those hands were really for. And then picture how many Solomon Reeveses we all walk straight past. Every single day of our lives. Picture how many people we have quietly decided are nobody because of the uniform they wear, or the color of their skin, or the work they do with their hands. Picture how many quiet, invisible people are walking around this world right now, carrying a truth we would never in 1,000 years dream that they know, watching a world that stopped watching them a long time ago. That is why I told you this story. Because the man they laughed at was never nobody. He never was. Not for one single second. And the strongest thing I have ever seen a human being do was to keep his hand open. And offered, when every last thing in the world was screaming at him, to close it into a fist. If you have ever been made to feel invisible, if you have ever done everything exactly right, and had them come for you anyway, if you have ever refused to become the very thing that was trying to break you, then you already understand something that Chad Whitlock never learned. Right up until the moment a jury read his name, the quiet ones are not weak. The quiet ones are the ones you should have never, ever crossed. If this story moved you, do me one favor. Hit that like button so more people get to hear it. Subscribe to The Silent Verdict, because the invisible people always have the last word here. And leave a comment below. And tell me about the strongest person you ever underestimated in your life. I read every single one of them. I will see you in the next story.